What is your assessment of this unprecedented crisis we're living in at this moment? What does it tell us about some of the failures of capitalism in this moment and the threat of disaster capitalist solutions?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to say how thrilled I am to be with you, to be in dialogue with Angela, a hero of mine, to be with this incredible group of organizers, and to be in a global conversation. I've been hearing from people all around the world who have tuned in, some at ungodly hours. And I think it speaks to our deep desire for connection. And I think we feel that more than ever because so many of us are being denied something we've taken for granted for our whole lives, which is the ability to be in person with our comrades. And we also have to remember that at the same time, so many people do not have the luxury of quarantine, whether because they do not have homes to quarantine in or because they're being worked off their feet. So I think the quick answer to your question is that capitalism is the disaster. Yes, I've written about disaster capitalism, but this is a crisis created by capitalism. The pandemic itself is an expression of our war on nature, of diseases coming from wilderness into the human sphere because we are encroaching onto the wilderness more and more. We are seeing in every way, we know that this disease preys on weak immune systems. But I think if we zoom out, what we see is that our economic system, which is so willing and indeed is built upon the willingness to sacrifice life in the interest of profit, and always has been, whether the transatlantic slave trade or whether the natural world in the face of the climate crisis. That system has created so many pre-existing conditions for this crisis to deepen, has weakened our collective immune system, and created the conditions in which this virus runs rampant. And this expresses itself in so many ways, whether the for-profit medical system in this country, in the United States, or public healthcare systems in Italy, in the UK, that have been starved by relentless austerity for decades, or whether the denigration of the work of care, which expresses itself in failing to provide protective equipment, or the denigration of this so-called service work, which is also really the work of care, which we see expressed in the way people delivering food, making food, packing boxes are treated as disposable. In every way, all of this is making the crisis, the virus spread faster and out of control. But in addition to that, we also have disaster capitalism, which means that we are seeing what we always see, this corporate opportunism that sees this pain, this need, and doesn't say, how do we solve it? How do we save lives? It says, how can I further enrich my own interests? So that is expressing itself right now with environmental regulations being suspended in China, in the United States, in the name of spurring the economy. It expresses itself in attacks on financial regulations. It's the wish list that gets pushed forward under cover of crisis again and again, and also explicit attacks on our ever weakened democracy. So we see Viktor Orban in Hungary, and we see Jair Bolsonaro, and we see Benjamin Netanyahu, and we see Trump himself, all of them making these extreme power grabs for extra powers of surveillance, but in the case of Orban and Netanyahu, ruled by decree with no end in sight.
And now I'd like to turn to you, Angela, and also to give you an opportunity to share sort of what is your assessment of the current moment? What is your assessment of what's happening? What's to come? So I'd like to turn it over to you.
Well, good afternoon. First of all, let me say that I am really honored to be in dialogue with you, Naomi. And thank you, Tinjiwe, and and Barbara Ransby and Mo Mitchell and all of the other organizers from the Rising Majority who pull this amazing teaching together. I guess the only thing I would add would be that for those of us who feel alone because we have been compelled to forego the in-person social contacts that should sustain us, that always sustained us, I think we can feel strengthened and energized by the fact that we are connected to people all over the planet who at this moment are experiencing similar conditions. And I'm thinking about what's happening in Palestine now. I'm thinking about what's happening in Kurdistan, especially Syrian Kurdistan. I'm thinking about populations that are already subject to different modes of repression, who are much more likely to suffer during this period of failed response to the coronavirus.
How do we understand this moment through an abolitionist lens? There's been call for release of folks who are locked up in jails and in prisons. And so what do you make of all of this? And how, what does it mean to, as a movement, be an abolitionist, in this time?
Well, first of all, Tinjiwe, thank you very much for this question that highlights the impact of the current conditions, the virus, and the attempt to mitigate it on people who have already been forced to shelter in place. If there's been so much concern about people in situations such as cruise ships where rapid transmission is inevitable, we should, of course, be even more concerned about people in jails and prisons and immigrant detention facilities. Under the current conditions, however, a, say, 3-month sentence can be tantamount to a death sentence. Here in California, the governor has ordered no new intakes into the state system, which is a good thing. But it's possible that there will be such a backlog that the county jails will be severely overcrowded. And by the way, this would be a very appropriate time to shut down Rikers in New York. And I'm in Oakland, California now, where I live. And of course, many organizations such as Critical Resistance, No New Jails, All of Us or None, the Transgender, Gender Variant, Intersex Justice Project. These organizations have demanded that many prisoners be released. And it's true that thousands of prisoners have already been released, but that is just a drop in the bucket, considering that 2.3 million people are behind bars in this country. We're especially demanding the immediate release of elders in prison. But of course, when we consider the fact that imprisonment always speeds up aging, when we speak of elders, we're talking about people over 50 years old. And I know most people who are 50 don't necessarily consider themselves old in the so-called free world, but that is not the case behind bars. They're also calling for the release of all kids who are in juvenile facilities and all people who are awaiting trial. They're also demanding an end to the so-called quality of life policing, of which creates the opportunity for the unnecessary arrest of so many people. And extremely important, a halt to all operations conducted by ICE. Because I think when we speak about the prison industrial complex, it's so important to recognize that immigrant detention is in many ways at the forefront of that process. What all this should teach us is that decarceration needs to happen. Decarceration, which is an important abolitionist strategy. And it needs to happen not simply for the sake of those who are behind bars, but for the sake of everyone's health. You know, I was reading Mike Davis's article in the Jacobin, which he called the Corona crisis is a monster fueled by capitalism. And he made the point that the current pandemic expands the argument. Global capitalism now appears biologically unsustainable in the absence of an international public health infrastructure. But he says, such an infrastructure will never exist until people's movements break the power of big pharma and for-profit healthcare. So yeah, abolition, I think an abolitionist lens requires us to think broadly and to remember, for example, that there are those who are unhoused. Even if we do succeed in the effort to engage in decarceration of vast numbers of people who are behind bars, many of those who leave jails or prisons will have only the street as a site to shelter in place. And that shelter in place order incorporates a logic that assumes that people have houses and that people have money for food and also the means with which to stay in connection with others. Many, those in prison, those who've been released, don't have that luxury. So this leads us to talk about the need for accessible and free housing and food. If Iran could release 70,000 prisoners out of 240,000, that's approximately 1/3 of its prison population, the US should be able to follow suit, which means authorities should release at least 765,000 people from custody at this moment.
How have we gotten a glimpse of what is possible?
Well, a great deal is required of us in this moment, especially because we are only in the early stages of this tremendous crisis. I think the lesson of the moment is that once you recognize that you are in an emergency, a great deal is possible. And so many of us, on this call, in this conversation and listening in, have spent their lives trying to convince the rest of the world, powerful interests, that the status quo is an emergency. Whether it is mass incarceration, whether it is absolutely untenable levels of inequality and injustice, whether it is our war on nature. What gets declared an emergency is an expression of power. And in the United States, what we saw is actually a fair amount of pushback in the early days. And this is a big part of the reason why the US is as unprepared as it was. They didn't see it as a crisis. They didn't see it as an emergency. And a lot of people said out loud on Fox News and outlets like it that they actually just thought old people and sick people should just quietly die in the name of the stock market. And I think the only reason why there has been an emergency mobilization, even though it has been inadequate in the face of this crisis, I think honestly has a lot to do with the geographic travels of this virus, in the sense that it sort of hit parts of the world that frankly had a stronger social fabric before it hit the United States. And so we had precedents from China, from Southern Europe, where economies were shut down to save lives, and that kind of forced the hand of the Trump administration. I honestly don't know whether they ever would have done it if it hadn't hit Southern Europe first and they had been forced in this way. So crisis blows open the sense of what is possible, right? When I wrote the shock doctrine and quoted Milton Friedman, and now it gets quoted a lot, that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And when the crisis occurs, it depends on what ideas are lying around, right? That quote, and some of you may have heard me say that, the reason why Milton Friedman was as focused on having an intellectual infrastructure of disaster preparedness for the right, for the corporations, is because he understood that when capitalism produces its own crises and the injustices of the system are laid bare for all to see, as happened during the Great Depression, it is actually a huge opportunity for the left. And Milton Friedman wrote in a letter to Augusto Pinochet in the 70s that he said, "I believe that everything went wrong in your country as well as mine in the 1930s when people got the idea that they could do good things with other people's money." So in other words, the whole strategy that they are deploying in order to move so quickly in the face of crisis to push forward their wish list is because they are afraid that we will push ours. Mm-hmm. They are afraid that we will demand precisely what Angela has been talking about, that we empty the jails, that we demand homes for all, that we say, wait a minute, you had a spare $6 trillion? We could do a damn good start of a Green New Deal with that, right? I mean, if you can pay people to stay home, you can pay people to retrain out of the fossil fuel sector, right? If corporations are on their knees asking for bailouts, the highest polluting sectors on the planet, oil companies, gas companies, airlines, car companies, cruise ship companies, that means that we can take ownership over these sectors. We can wind them down if they are at war with life on Earth. We can take care of their workers. Our job is to kick open the door of radical possibility as wide and as long as possible. And I think, the work that you have been doing, Tinjiwe, and the movement for Black Lives all of these years, we are in a better position in this crisis than we were the last time the global economy collapsed in 2008, when we were very clear that we were being forced to pay for the crisis of the bankers, and we occupied squares and we said no. And I know there are people listening in from Southern Europe who were part of the movement of the squares and went on to form Podemos. But in that moment, we didn't put forward our radical alternatives with enough courage, with enough power. And that is what we need to do. And I am so inspired by the workers at Amazon and Whole Foods and Instacart and GE and the nurses and all the frontline workers who now realize how essential they are, despite having had their labor so denigrated that some of them are having to wear literally garbage bags to protect themselves from this virus. That is how capitalism sees them, literally as trash, are standing up and saying, no, we hold the world up. And that's the energy that we need to be building on, that kind of worker power. And we are going to have to be exercising our right to stop, to withhold that labor. And we need to be supporting those workers in every possible way that we can. So sorry, I'm ranting, but we need to kick the door open, keep it open. It's a race against time because we haven't seen their worst ideas yet. Angela mentioned Gaza. Folks in Gaza have been telling us for years that they're a laboratory for the rest of the world. The first Corona cases were diagnosed in a Mumbai slum today. Okay, that's very worrying because what Angela is saying is true about people's inability to shelter in place when you don't have a shelter. But what does a carceral state do in response to that? What does a Modi do? What does a Duterte do? What does a Bolsonaro do? It seals in the slum, right? It turns it into Gaza, okay? So unless we are out here saying, no, everybody has a right to a home, there's a lot of empty hotels out there.
Yep.
we will see a lot worse than we're seeing now.
Angela, if you could share, what do you believe is required of us in this moment, and what has been made, what is possible?
Well, I absolutely agree with Naomi that we should think about the similarities between the era of the 1930s and the present. And I think that many people are recognizing how unequipped capitalism is to truly serve the needs of people and other beings on the planet. The reason there's such a healthcare crisis is precisely because of the privatization process that began in the 1980s, which is the same era that saw the rise of the prison industrial complex. Hospitals now largely operate under the profit mandates of capital, and empty beds are not profitable. Stockpiles of equipment from ventilators to masks are not compatible with the just-in-time production. So global capitalism is really responsible for the inability to address this pandemic. It's also responsible for the vast numbers of people in prison and in detention facilities, and for the high cost of healthcare and housing and education. And I think people have the capacity to realize that it did not have to happen this way. That healthcare does not have to be treated as a commodity to be bought and sold, that people don't have to be in prison simply because there's no place for them in the current economy. But I also want to point out that the crisis is revealing the nature of racial capitalism. From the racism directed against Asian Americans, following the lead of what's his name, the current occupant of the White House, to the failure to provide testing kits to hospitals and clinics in Black neighborhoods. Asian Americans have been spit at and yelled at and physically attacked. And in places like the Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee, which had set up for testing, there was a severe delay because they were not provided with the tests. I think that we are recognizing, and we have the capacity to organize against the structural racism that drives our institutions, the everyday racism. And I think that we have the capacity to do feminist organizing, what we might call abolition feminist organizing, because all of these are feminist issues. Racism is a feminist issue. Homelessness is a feminist issue. Prison abolition is a feminist issue. And, but I think that, that we should take into consideration the fact that so many of the people who are at the center of this crisis, on the front lines of this crisis, are women. Women of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, poor women, trans women, women especially in the countries of the global South. And so I think that we should seize upon this as an opportunity to do the kind of organizing that enhances the sense of a need for international solidarity. This has the capacity to perhaps bring us out of our US-centric slumber, and to recognize that we can take leadership from people who are organizing in other parts of the world, domestic workers all over the world who are now losing their job, of course, because of the stay-at-home orders, those who care for people in the for-profit nursing industries, such the nursing home industry, such as the outbreak that happened in Washington. And I just want to say one thing about gender violence and child abuse, because it seems that the whole notion of staying at home is assumed to imply that we can retreat to this kind of nurturing environment, this refuge. But for many, they're being forced to spend 24 hours a day with their abusers, unable to connect with those who have been their lifelines, and children and women who are abused. I think that this isn't, we should seize upon this as an opportunity to do the kind of organizing that is going to enhance our sense of belongingness to the world and enhance our sense of the possibility of moving beyond capitalism.
And so, Cindy, I'd like to pose this next question to you, which is, what else do we need to be thinking about or paying attention to in this moment as we look to what's happening around the world?
I think to pick up on a couple of points that Angela and Naomi made, Antonio Gramsci, along with Friedman, writes a lot about crisis. And the crisis, it either gives us an opportunity to do something, or it gives the right wing an opportunity. And I feel that we have the opportunity to break the back of global neoliberalism, or we look into a future of further authoritarianism or fascism. It's an opportunity for us to rethink the reorganization of society on a global level, from the very local. There are people living across the world and inside the United States in dire conditions with no access to water, no electricity, precarity. And part of what we're also seeing hand in hand, we will see deep levels of repression and the curbing of democracy and democratic rights with the use of militarization. And I think this is one of those moments. Not only are we making those immediate demands about masks and ventilators and funds to hospitals and to grocery workers, we have to also take a stand against no war, no militarization, and stopping the occupation. We need to end the sanctions. Sanctions already were slow deaths. People are gonna die not only of coronavirus, but they're gonna die of hunger. And we need to be in solidarity now more than ever with people from Iran, from Venezuela, from North Korea, from Cuba, Palestine, Zimbabwe, and the 30 other countries that have sanctions against them. Number two, I think it's an opportunity for us to really think about how many movements around the world have been experimenting with alternatives to capitalism, that have really thought about the needs. The social movements have been putting out food sovereignty as an alternative. Food production, right? Small farmers cool the planet is what La Via Campesina says. Feminist economy, the vibrant feminist movement around the world that has been in motion, that has been at the forefront of authoritarianism, has been talking about the need for a feminist economy. Environmentalists, indigenous peoples have been talking about EJ communities have been talking about a regenerative economy. Indigenous peoples in the Andes talking about buen vivir, and different experiments around socialism of the 21st century. And I think it's a moment for us to be able to say, we need desperately an alternative to this capitalist, colonialist, patriarchal, racist, ableist system. And we've been working, and all of our movements across the world have been working on those alternatives. We know how to be able to serve the needs of people and center life in a very different way. How do we center, now that home has become the site of struggle, as Angela said, it's also the site of hope, but it's also a moment where reproductive labor has automatically become so visible, right? From our homes to our communities to our workplaces. Reproductive labor of folks that do service are now at the forefront of saving the planet. So there's a couple of places that I think around the world that there's been very clear demands starting to be articulated to end the sanctions now. The second one is to cut military budgets. And then 3, there's been this bailout, being able to not bail out corporations and CEOs and transnational corporations, but to actually bail out the people, because we're in a moment where that is what is in tension. And I think that we need to be able to do that. We need to support homes for all. We need to support services and relief effort for undocumented people, for all people.
So I want to bring in Maurice Mitchell with the Working Families Party into this conversation. You know, many people have talked about the stimulus bill and how it centered the needs of financial institutions and corporations and not necessarily the needs of the people. And so we need to talk about sort of who's in office. And this is an election year. And so can you share a little bit about sort of what are the implications of this pandemic for this election?
Traditionally, movement organizers have built power, electoral power or otherwise, through face-to-face conversations, at the doors, through canvassing at the doors, or in our communities, either small groups of people coming together or mass rallies, right? We have conversations, we build connections, we build relationships. Relationships are the most basic building block of our movements. And now we can't build relationships in the same way because we have to shelter in place and we have to observe social distancing in order to save our lives and save the lives of people in our community. So we must adapt. And we are adapting by engaging in all means of communication in order to talk to our folks, using texting and calling folks and digital organizing like we're doing right now. We're using color codes on our doors or on our windows to communicate our needs and whether or not we're safe. Can't hold a traditional rally? Well, we could hold a Zoom call with tens of thousands of people like we're doing right now. Or we could raise our voices out our windows like many people are doing around the world. This is the moment when we're going to have to adapt and we're gonna have to innovate in order to continue to build the bonds of our relationships, even as we're isolated. We're isolated, but we're certainly not alone. And this is a moment when people on the far right and Republicans are calling for universal basic income. And at the same time, they're calling for having grandparents essentially sacrifice themselves for the market. And so what that demonstrates to me is that the logic of neoliberal capitalism is no longer making sense in this moment, and that organized capital and the folks in Washington that prop them up are in disarray. And they'll do what's necessary in order to prop up the system. And if that incidentally means providing some people relief, so be it. So this is a moment when our political leadership and our clarity is so critical. Now, the Working Families Party and many of our allies are developing these new tactics for the moment because we cannot retreat in this moment. We need leaders that are accountable to working people, and not just in the United States, but globally, right? And there's gonna be a tug of war between the interests of corporations and the interest of working people. And so social movements and people coming from social movements could play a critical role in filling that gap. Which is why we need more and more people on the local and statewide level who are coming from social movements and accountable to social movements running for office. So some folks might question whether or not that's true, that whether or not the energy of the left is better spent in doing direct action or building mass movements, and we shouldn't waste our time with elections in this moment. But what we're seeing play out, I think, underscores why building electoral power is crucial in this moment. Imagine, if you will, if Donald Trump were not president. The federal response would look very different. We could measure that in hundreds of thousands of lives. To use a more local example, Governor Kemp in Georgia has utterly failed to grapple with this pandemic, and people are going to die because of his response. Now, just let that sink in for a moment. People are going to die because an election was stolen from Stacey Abrams in 2018. So given that, we understand that elections aren't our only strategy in this moment. We need strikes, rent strikes, mortgage strikes, strikes of essential workers, like Naomi talked about, like the workers who are gallantly striking, Amazon and Instacart workers and others. We need mutual aid on the ground, and we're seeing a lot of that. We need protest movements making bold demands and offering inspiring, soul-affirming solutions to people who desperately need them. But we also need to translate all of that into electoral consequences. Working people must seize all levels of power, and working people, we simply don't have the luxury to leave any tool on the table, including electoral tools. And that's why we have to make sure that democracy actually continues. And when I say democracy, I mean, we need to ensure that true democracy, radical democracy, blooms in this moment, right? So not just election day, but 365 days of the week. This is a very fragile and uncertain moment, and nothing is given. Authoritarians around the world will mimic each other. And we need to ensure that the right wing in our country does not use this moment as an opportunity in order to snuff the little semblance of democracy we have left. And so, you know, we could look at what's already taken place in Hungary, and I guarantee you, Donald Trump is paying attention. And so we have to be vigilant. We have to wake ourselves up from the dream of American exceptionalism. This is truly a global movement.
A lot of what I know about the transformative power of crisis, I learned from living in Argentina. After Argentina's economy collapsed in 2001, and they went through 5 presidents in 3 weeks, and everything collapsed, and people started building something new in the rubble. And one of the things that I witnessed and really changed me was a movement of factories that were being abandoned by their owners, being turned into workers' cooperatives. And I raise that because when we talk about international solidarity, and I really appreciate Cindy talking about how we need to learn from the leadership in the global South and from indigenous communities in the global North, from the food sovereignty movement. We also need to learn from the factory occupation movement, because there is going to be a collapse of small businesses. And if we don't want to end up in a world where Jeff Bezos is the last man standing, then what needs to happen is that workers who are working at restaurants that are closing, and nail salons that are closing, and all kinds of businesses that are closing, have the right to take over those workplaces and turn them into cooperatives. I think that's part of what we need to be fighting for. There's legislation that this is part of what a people's bailout means. One other idea that I think is important is I think there's incredible digital organizing going on right now. One of the things we're seeing is that we have a right to the internet. It is a public utility, but right now it is in the hands of a few very large corporations. And when we talk about repression and we talk about authoritarian responses to this crisis, that includes the ability, unfortunately, to unilaterally shut down our organizing when we're organizing on corporate platforms. So we need to be aware of that, and we need to be ready for it. If we look at what has happened in India under Modi and just locking down Kashmir's access to the internet, we need to be able to find each other without Mark Zuckerberg's permission. And there's lots of different ways that needs to manifest, but I think it needs to be front of mind. At the same time as we fight for a true digital commons as part of the transformation we need. I want to shout out the People's Bailout. People can go to that website. The Green Stimulus, people can check that out. I mentioned the leap.org. These are our organizations that are putting forward some really key frameworks, and other people have mentioned other ones. Let's remember a couple of things that a lot of us are realizing. One, we miss each other. So even as we spend a lot of time on screens, I think at the other end of this, personally, I'd like to spend less time on screens and more time in community and in face-to-face. And I want to live in a world that makes that easier and more possible. Let's remember the love that we feel for caregivers. And let's build an economy that values and lifts up and is rooted in the need for us to care for one another. let's remember the solace that we've taken in nature in the midst of all of this in the spring. And let's build an economy that is about taking care of each other and taking care of the planet. It is possible to do. It will take all the tools that Mo mentioned, the rent strikes, the debt strikes, maybe even a general strike. I don't think it will have a hashtag, so we're going to have to figure out ways of organizing that are not brought to us by Silicon Valley. One of the things that that is hardest about this crisis is having a 7-year-old and teaching him to be afraid of people. Because everybody's got germs. And that is the exact opposite of the lesson that I try to teach him, and that I think we all know, and that what this has all been about, which is that we are all we have. And as people try to turn us against each other, we have to remember that. And even as we isolate, we must reach towards each other and build maximum power, because everything's on the line.
Angela, I'd love for you to share some words to all those that are listening and with us right now as we close this program.
Well, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to have this exchange. I have learned a great deal in this last hour, and I'm aware of the fact that that people are watching from other parts of the world. And I'm asking myself whether we can create similar conversations involving people from Africa, from South America, from India, of course. I'm thinking about the fact that in Brazil, the situation is far worse than it is here. And I'm not going to talk about the similarities between the two leaders. But I do think that we in the United States can find leadership from people in places like Brazil and South Africa who are searching to creatively address this crisis. What I keep coming back to is the fact that we are at this moment compelled to live within the boundaries of nation states. But nation states no longer function in a way that helps enhance our lives. As a matter of fact, the nation state is becoming increasingly obsolete. And this is what we're seeing during this crisis. So I'm really looking forward to international, global conversations and organizing. And I think that these kinds of conversations should happen over and over. Digital organizing, yes. And we need to be prepared to hit the ground running when we're finally able to be in contact with each other in person. We're going to need to organize massive demonstrations and movements and supporting. We're going to have to support all of the strikes, and we're going to have to try to create lasting formations that will assist us in moving away from this capitalist monster and toward a better future.